My name is Lucas Ladenthin, and I did my senior research project on the impact of player leaders within establishing team culture. And I looked at the communication both between coach and players and these player leaders and the rest of the team to look at the impact that had on team culture, because what I was trying to look into when I was starting my research was why do certain teams underperform when maybe they have a roster that is loaded with talent and just for whatever reason struggles to win, versus the opposite of teams that maybe are more average or lacking in talent, but they can overperform what that roster should be. And that was where I get into my hypothesis. My hypothesis on why that was is I think that player leaders hold equal power to the head coach as far as establishing team culture. And I think that coaches are aware of this, and coaches that can kind of utilize that power in a positive way. Almost normally we think of groupthink as a negative term, but in a way you can almost look at it, use it in a beneficial way for team success. So my research question when I was starting this, I was looking to, through the lens of trying to establish a high quality culture, and I wanted to know how much power players hold with their ability to lead and communicate with each other, independent of the head coach. Because obviously the head coach is going to wield a lot of power within a team setting, because they can communicate with everybody on the roster. But when that coach can't be around with every player, I'd almost say the majority of the time. So how players are communicating when that coach isn't there should be, in theory, could be very important. I opted to include my practical application over on the left side of the poster here, because I felt like as I was going through this, it's not, the application of it isn't just to team sports. Obviously, there is the coaching side of it, and there is takeaways for coaches, but it's more of just, this almost in a way just turned into studying group settings. So group theory and all that sort of stuff still applied. The theory that I came back to the most was Ernest Borman and his symbolic convergence theory. As far as theories that I looked at for more individualized, for the athlete's lens, you have achievement goal theory, just because in a way you're also trying to motivate these athletes, and so having that common goal is what's going to motivate people to work the most. And that's kind of where I think Ernest Borman, his symbolic convergence theory, in a way you're taking that concept but applying it to a group, in the fact that as a group you're trying to combine and find the same fantasy that you want to pursue. My research method, I conducted 2 surveys. One survey of QU athletes, and I sent out a coach survey initially to QU coaches, and then I was looking for more responses, so that I then in turn sent it out to more coaches within the Great Lakes Valley Conference. So as far as the questions that I opted to include on the poster here, I tried to show some that maybe surprised me with the responses, as well as trying to compare and contrast what both surveys said. So the top line, I was looking at, the questions were obviously worded differently, but I can ask coaches, do you think players can make or break team success? And I mean, it's a Likert scale, so it's not a yes/no, but if you follow the bell curve, leans heavily towards people agreeing. And then on the player side, I asked if players believe that communication and player leaders have played at least an equal role in team cohesion and success, as opposed to coach communication, and that was even more strongly towards the agreeing side than what the coach survey came up with. Part of what I asked coaches about on their survey was, when they're assembling a roster, what approach do they take to trying to find players? And what I mean by that is, essentially, when a coach is putting together a roster, are they looking for players that fit into what they believe they want their desired culture to be, or what their existing culture is? Or do you recruit the player just off of I'm looking for talent, and then I'm going to figure out how to communicate with them. And what most coaches said was that they do not recruit necessarily for talent, or for communication. They're looking for just the best players they can find, and then they tailor their communication style to those players. The next question I asked the players that I included on here was, when you're establishing a culture, do you think that players establish their culture independent of the head coach? And why I opted to include this question on the poster here is because I felt like the scattering of the responses was was shocking to me at first, especially the amount of the one which was a strongly disagree within the question, because I kind of felt like, based on the other responses I had seen, it seemed like there was a mutual understanding from both sides that player leaders play a very large role in establishing that culture. But I think that question kind of showed is that there is still a relationship between the coach and those player leaders. The player leaders, they can't just go completely off on their own and now all of a sudden the entire team's following them. If there's a split or a disconnect between the two parties, between the head coach and the player leaders, there's just going to be a disconnect throughout the entire roster, as opposed to it's coaches versus players. And the next question I have for the coaches was looking at your best team. That's kind of what the wording I used throughout both of these surveys, was trying to have people reflect on the best teams they've been a part of. And for coaches, I asked them if they would consider that their best work as far as good communication. And coaches generally agreed that that was their best work, or maybe not best, but better work as far as communication. And then now getting into this pie chart that I have over here for the players, I asked if players had ever been a part of a team where a disconnect or where communication from players has really undermined messaging from the coach. This was another one. I kind of wasn't sure what to expect for a response, so I think having it being as close to 50-50 as it was surprising to me. I thought there was a decent chance that people might just kind of say no out of either A, they just haven't experienced it, or because they just don't, even though it's an anonymous survey, maybe are scared to they don't want to throw somebody under the bus or seem like they are doing that. And the last pie chart I have for the coaches, on the coach side of the survey, was asking them to think about their best teams, the best teams that they have coached, and whether or not they've been player-led teams. And so obviously there's 3 responses that got picked here, but the red one is no. The other 2 essentially mean yes. The green one just meant that they were going to say yes, but then elaborate on the next short answer question. That's what the quotes in the bottom left are from. And what happened for those coaches that did use the short answer section was there's a lot of one-sentence responses, but the general kind of message, if you were to summarize it, was coaches, their best teams were player-led teams, but it was some combination of upperclassmen or just players in general that they could trust to execute on their vision. And I asked players kind of the same question. I just, instead of framing it as a yes-no, I used the Likert scale and asked them thinking if they would consider the best teams they've been a part of player-led teams. They also skewed heavily towards agree or strongly disagree, similar to the pie chart for the coaches. And I have on the bottom right are some quotes from players. This was actually a follow-up to the question that had a pie chart of whether or not players have been a part of a team where there's been a disconnect in communication. And what the short answer responses really kind of showed, in my interpretation, was that there were 2 reasons that players said that this disconnect caused a problem. A lot of them framed it through either the coach's messaging was the problem, or the player leader's messaging was the problem. There was not usually a gray area where they said, well, maybe both sides had some valid points or both sides were wrong. It was a lot of either this coach they were valuing stats too much. They didn't actually care about coaching and putting the best team forward. Or it was the coach knew what they were talking about, but the player leaders were not bought in, and then kind of because of that, the rest of the roster was also then not bought in. But when I kind of had a chance to look through all that, the conclusion that I ultimately came to was that obviously both sides do hold power, kind of like what I was looking at my hypothesis. I do think that player leaders hold a substantial amount of power as far as establishing team culture, but I do not think that it is something where players have their own individual power to go to completely defy the coach. I think the coach still has power in that what he says is going to kind of almost establish a baseline. It's going to establish a bar, right? Or which way you deviate from that, or how far you deviate, that is where player leaders kind of come in. And then moving on, what I included about future kind of application or future questions I would like to answer. Some ways I would have liked if I had more time, I would have looked for some clarification on a couple of the responses. I would have liked to do maybe like a focus group with some coaches to try to see if the responses are just coaches kind of giving uniform responses based on what they think the correct response is, or if this actually is what the majority of coaches believe. Another area that I think would be interesting to research would be the difference between an individualistic culture like we have in the United States versus a collectivist culture like you maybe have in other countries like Japan or East Asia. Because I think a big part of what spurs this disconnect, or what gives these player leaders so much power in the United States, is that we view ourselves as an individual, that we are an individualistic culture, and therefore every player, almost in a way, as a coach, you almost have to convince every player individually that that's beneficial for them to buy into what you are preaching. Whereas in collectivist cultures, there might be a lot less legwork on the coach's part to get that buy-in, and maybe as a byproduct, you can almost start more on the actual coaching or building players up. But that was kind of the most interesting parts of what I found out through my research. I would have, if I could have gone more in depth, I would have liked to try to find a more actual application, as opposed practical application to maybe somebody who's trying to get into coaching, trying to form a coaching philosophy or communication style. Although that was another one of my takeaways, was that your communication style should be able to vary based on the roster you have. Yeah, that's about all I had to talk about with my poster presentation here.